I'm not a historian. I don't claim to be. I think if I went back to school now, I might study more history. I didn't find it very interesting in school, but that's about all I read now. I'm not a historian, but today I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about history, particularly history, the United States higher education system history. And I think there's some things that we can learn from each other. That's the quote that Bill had yesterday. That's the great thing about this project, is our chance to learn from each other. And hopefully that will be the case today. Part of the lesson, I think, is that things don't happen very often by chance. I know that's the story at UC Riverside. Our success is not by chance. It's very much by design, very deliberate interactions and our implementation strategies. And I think that same statement holds true not just at the institutional level, but also at national levels as well. You heard already about our university. I won't go into more of it. That's a slide some of you saw yesterday. That's our university in the foreground. We're about 50 miles east of Los Angeles and 50 miles west of Palm Springs. So if you're ever in the Palm Springs, Los Angeles area, please stop by and see us. It's a beautiful location and a great university. To history. This is a graph of global enrollment in higher education from 1970 to present. It's actually 2014, I think, is the date. And you can see the huge increase. This is a percentage of the population, basically the college-age population, 18 to 22 or thereabouts. So the percentage of those students who are enrolled in some kind of tertiary education program across the country, and around the world rather. And you can see that we've had tremendous growth from the mid-90s to the present time, a huge spike internationally. And this is South Africa on the same map. So in 1970, you were about 4% of the college-age population going to college, and now you're nearly 20. Not quite as steep as the rest of the nation, but the pattern maintains. I put numbers on that. Between 2000 and 2014, we doubled the numbers of students. Over 200 million students around the globe now in higher education programs. This is the United States. Excuse me. It goes back another 100 years to 1860 rather than 1970. To give you a sense of how our graph lays on top of the global graph. And you can see the same thing, a huge rise in enrollment in the United States. For me, there's two parts to the graph. There's a very long history. We were founded as a nation in 1776. From 1776 to 1960, almost 200 years, the curve is pretty flat. And then it changes dramatically. And we believe that there were some things that our nation did deliberately during that time to increase that access. Now, this conference, of course, is about success. Another important point that flows through all my comments, I think, today is the definition of success. For most of our history in the United States, success was access. We believed that if people were getting to college, that was a pretty good measure. And so these graphs, until pretty recently, were the primary means for us to judge whether or not we were being successful in helping students move through universities. I was struck by Minister Pandor's comments yesterday about quantitative versus qualitative measures of success, notions of what we do to create citizens and how our curricula shape people. Heard both a de Klerk versus Mandela example was telling. I'm tempted to do a Obama-Trump, but I'll let you decide if that's apropos. But it does make you, at least made me reflect on the nature of a total system and what kinds of things are important to the system on behalf of the nation that it serves. So that's back 100 years to 1860. Let's go back a little further. These are our roots in the United States. Everybody knows about Harvard in large measure because Harvard was the first university in our country and had a huge head start on most of the rest of us. But take a note of one of the recruiting brochures for Harvard College in its early days. To advance learning and perpetuate it to prosperity, dreading to leave an illiterate ministry to the churches when our present ministers shall lie in the dust. Harvard wasn't created to do the things that all of us do in our universities. Harvard was created to make sure there were enough ministers in the colonies in the 17th century. That was the purpose. Now, it has evolved, grown greatly in all kinds of ways, but that was a pretty singular focus, and it drove most of the rest of the universities in our nation for many years. It wasn't until 1740 that the University of Pennsylvania was created, also a private university, but with a more holistic kind of perspective on things. Excuse me. And then University of Georgia was our first public university, but the two at the bottom, North Carolina and Virginia, were the two universities created in the way that we think of universities today. They're both public universities and much more holistic in terms of the sciences, humanities, culture, as well as professional service. So it took us a while, from 1636 to turn of the century, the 18th century, for us to really, 19th century rather, for us to really get where we needed to be in terms of a framework for education. Excuse me. So back to our graph. 100 years later, or nearly 100 years, that's where we were in the United States, 0.02%, as opposed to the current global 39%. 39% of the college age population globally. We're at 2.2% of the entire population after a couple hundred years of practice at this. And again, the steep curve later on. So what happened? Some things happened deliberately in our country. In 1862, for those of you who are U.S. history buffs, that's the middle of our Civil War, there was an effort proposed by several people. Justin Morrill was the person who got his name on the bill, from New Hampshire, I believe, or Vermont, to open the doors to universities. Up until that time, even the public universities had been pretty limited in enrollment. Almost all white men, most all of them studying to take over their father's business or to do something else in the professional world. So in 1862, Justin Morrill and his colleagues, Abraham Lincoln signed the bill, took land and gave it to states if they were willing to use the land to build universities for the common people. Now, let me unpack that a little bit. They took land, well, they took federal land, but much like the experiences in South Africa, the federal government simply took land from the indigenous peoples and called it federal land. And then they gave it to states and told the states you can either build on the land or you can sell the land and use the money to build a university. But you can only take the land if you build a university. The university then has to be one that serves common people and does the whole range of services to society. Almost all the schools were agricultural because at that time in our history, almost everybody was a farmer. Most all of them at the time had some kind of engineering component because we were all looking to build the nation, but also, of course, the cultures, the arts, the humanities, and the other sciences. Interestingly, while our timelines are different, some of the dynamics are much the same. That transfer of land and building of universities happened across much of the country. But in many parts of the country, it remained a pretty separate kind of system. So there were very few African Americans in particular who were enrolled in these universities, even though they were broad in enrollment. It wasn't until 1890 that the federal government realized that they hadn't made very much progress with African American students and did another Morrill Act, a second group, just for colleges and universities that historically only enrolled African American students. So it took us twice to get there. But even that didn't make a big difference from the graph. You can see we're still pretty flat. So what did happen? Another set of government activities. And there are four here that happened pretty close in time. Let me talk quickly about each of them. The GI Bill, in 1944, actually before the end of the war, it was the middle of the war again. Things happened in the United States in the middle of wars. The Morrill Act happened in the middle of our Civil War. The GI Bill, early stages of that were discussed and debated in 1942, actually well before we even knew who was going to win the war. But the GI Bill was a bill designed to help returning veterans enroll in universities. Vast majority of those veterans ended up in schools that were created during the Morrill Act 100 years earlier. So that that frame was important to us. It turns out that the GI Bill was so effective that by 1947, 2 years after the war was over, over half the students in all of higher education in America were veterans on the GI Bill. It was a huge push in terms of the enrollment, but also the nature of the students in our universities. 1957, Russia put Sputnik into space, and it caused a panic across America. We came out of World War II thinking we were pretty impressive folks, and we weren't ready for somebody else to go into space before us, and it woke up the nation. Lots of things happened, and one of the things that happened was the National Defense Education Act. It was seen the only way for us to keep up with or catch up with the Russians was to invest heavily in higher education. So there was a national move again for investments. And that was the first time in America that we started to have loans to support students going to college. It was through that call to arms, essentially, in 1958. Again, parallels, timelines are different, and nuances are a bit different, but while we had a civil war. I was going to say we won the Civil War. Depends on which side you're on, I suppose. That's why it was a civil war. Well, we had a civil war in the middle of the 19th century that abolished slavery in the United States, and it was to abolish segregation more broadly. The vestiges remained for 100 years. So it wasn't until 1964 that we explicitly disallowed discrimination across the nation. That had a huge impact. But the lower right one maybe has as big an impact on any, and I want to talk a bit about that. The Higher Education Act of 1965. In both pictures, for those of you history buffs, is Lyndon Johnson there shaking Martin Luther King's hand on the left and signing a bill on the right in a gymnasium. He actually signed it in the gymnasium of his own university where he went to college in Texas. The Higher Education Act did lots of things. It was a coming together of investments and ideas for higher education in America. And it was seen as a part of a bigger complex. Up until the Morrill Act, only rich people went to college, by and large. Their parents could afford it, they went, they paid their tuitions, and they graduated and went on to me, they came in rich people, they generally left rich people and stayed rich people. The Morrill Act helped popularize that notion so that we had regular people going to school. And the states, while they got the initial land to build these universities, then were seen to have the responsibility to run them in a way that maintained their accessibility, maintained their affordability. And in large measure, that was the case. It was also the case, though, just as we discussed so much around the tables here yesterday, that there were an awful lot of students for whom that wasn't enough. So for the vast majority of Americans, the rich people were already going to school. The big bulk in the middle of the economy were able to manage these state-supported Morrill Act kind of institutions. But there was a set of very poor people who just couldn't even do that. And so the rich could pay their tuition. The states could make it affordable for most. The federal government would step in and make sure that those least able had some support. And that was the Higher Education Act of 1964. It provided extended loan programs and other kind of support to the very poor students in America. Now, I make these points because that was the understanding in the middle of the 20th century in America. And as you heard yesterday from some of the other discussions of our situation, that relationship and set of expectations has eroded over time and has led to some of the challenges that we have today. But back to the main story. So what did that do for enrollment in the United States? You can see, after being flat for a couple hundred years, the right kinds of investments over a period of really just a decade had a huge impact on the slope of the curve. It turned the corner for us and has continued ever since. And if we go back to the first couple slides with South Africa, your slope really hasn't made that bend yet. But we managed to pull it off about 50 years ago. So we thought we were doing pretty well. We were leading in much of the world in terms of access to higher education. We were thriving as an economy. Everything was going well. But we had some dirty secrets that we were hiding. This is another way of looking at success by means of who's really managing to be rewarded in this system. And for those in the back, it's 1970 on the left side and 2014 on the right side. The top line are students from families whose income is in the top quartile in the United States. So those are the rich people, okay? So what it says is, if your family has means today in the United States, you've got about a 60% chance of having graduated from college by the time you're 24. The bottom line are students from families from the lowest income. We know enough about distributions and bell curves to know that there's many smart kids in the rich families that are in the poor families, right? But if you come from a family in the lowest quartile of income, today you have about a 12% chance of graduating from college. There are some who have done the numbers and will tell you the best determiner of eventual graduation success in America is your postal code. If we know where you live, we can pretty much predict whether or not you're going to graduate from college, and these data bear that out. So, well, we were very concerned about making sure we had access for all kinds of students to come to universities. It was the case that it didn't really work well across the socioeconomic dimensions in our country. These are the current situations for us. These are graduation rates. And just a little bit of background on US. It says 6-year graduation rates. We are generally a 4-year graduation profile across the country. The government has moved to using 6-year graduation rates as a measure because, by and large, if you haven't graduated after 4 years, you're probably not going to graduate at all. At Riverside, our average time to degree is 4.2 years, so most of the students are done long before 6. But again, if you're not done by 6, you never will be, so, or almost never will be. So these numbers look to be, for us, pretty inclusive of the ones who are going to graduate. And they're pretty striking numbers. The ones on the left are Pell students. Sarah talked a little bit about Pell students yesterday. That program that we talked about here, Higher Education Act of '65, one of the things it did was start to think differently about poor students in America. The federal government really didn't have much of a role in higher education in our country until that point in time. And they began this focus on poor students. Today, probably the primary measure of that for us are Pell Grants. These are grants that only go to families based on their family income, and you have to be at the lowest levels in the country. So if you're a poor student in America and you get into college, you only have about a 50% chance of graduating. Worse yet, if you're an African American student in the United States today and you get into college, you only have a 4 in 10 chance of graduating. So while we, again, were very focused on access and proud of what we were achieving, we weren't being very effective for large swaths of our college-age growing group. You can see the differences, Latino, Caucasian, and Asian American. Big differences. The Asian American communities tend to be, many of them, local supportive communities with hard-driving a sense of what the future might be, and that culture has made an impact for them. Caucasians, of course, by far the dominant group in America. So this notion of rich people paying for tuition, states making sure that it worked in terms of affordability for most of us, and then the federal government doing the very poorest part, was a pretty good plan that worked for 20, 30, 40 years, and then started to fall apart. And it fell apart not because the rich people didn't have money anymore, they could still pay their part. And it didn't fall apart because the federal government stopped paying for poor people, although they didn't really pay a lot. It fell apart because the middle part didn't work anymore. We have 50 states, each of them with these universities in them, and each of them with their own sense of how they want to support them. Excuse me. And as the budgets in these states struggled at times, one of the easier things to cut became higher education. So it was the middle part, it was the state support for the cores of these universities that became a challenge for us. And it has driven our funding mechanisms in very bad ways. So this is recent data. The blue line at the bottom, and this is a percentage, the blue line at the bottom is student earnings. These are graduates of the university and how much money they made. Pretty much over this period of time, college graduates made about the same amount of money as they had in the past. But In order to get that same amount of money, they had to borrow more and more and more in each year. Now, I should have, I was looking last night, I should have on this graph a line that shows how much students who didn't go to college earn, and that line goes right down like this. So in America, just to stay even, you got to go to college, okay? You can stay even if you go to college, that's the blue line. But to stay even, you got to personally pay more and more and more. Let me put a finer point on that. UC Riverside is one of 10 campuses in the University of California system. You've probably heard of Berkeley and UCLA and San Diego and Riverside. They were all similar kind of schools serving the state. And we operate as a group. So we have one tuition. We have an admissions process for all of the students in one admissions process. We work very much as an integrated unit. These are University of California data from the last 20 years. Again, in the back, if you can't read the numbers at the bottom, 1990, 91 on the left-hand side, and 2016, 17 on the right-hand side. And this is the cost to go to the University of California for a student from California in US dollars. It's actually the cost of educating the student, I should say, because I want to make a difference between cost and price. We were spending about $24,000 a year on each student in the University of California in 1990. And you can see how that was comprised. 19,000 of those dollars came from the state of California. And only $2,670 came from tuition that we charged to the student. Now we jump ahead to 2016. We're now spending less per student by a long shot from what we did in 1990. We went from $24,000 a student to almost $19,000 a student. Huge decrease. So, and I know this is the same with all of you. People say, well, you got to be more cost effective. Well, shoot, we cut the cost to educate a student by a third. Isn't that cost effective? So we did everything we did to save money. But look at the part that the state of California has played. It went from $19,000 a student to $7,000 a student. And as a result, the gray bar at the top that the students are paying has grown appreciably. Now, if you're one of those rich families, that's probably not a big toot. If you're in the middle or on the poor side, it becomes a bigger challenge. And that set of bars, set of graphs, can be replicated across the United States in almost every state. The ratios, the blues and the grays and the rest may well change, but that dynamic is one that has vexed us. And the federal government is doing what they believe to be their part. And again, we could hedge on that as well. But it's this middle part that's really been a place for struggle for us. So much so that this is the troubling outcome. These are very recent data. The leftmost point is 2013. The rightmost point is 2017. And these were questions asked to Americans of whether or not a 4-year college degree is worth the cost. Now, if you're 65 and older, that's the black line, you say yes, okay? You could guess that that's because they're wise, they're experienced, or maybe because they've been through life far enough to have benefited from their college education, or maybe because they went to college at a time when it was quite affordable. So their mindset is affordable for me, and look what I got out of it. That's a no-brainer. The blue and the red lines in the middle cover those of us. I'm 64, that's why I had to say that. From 35 to 64. I didn't want to be in the 65 and older group. I'm in the 64 group. I'm with the 35-year-olds. The blue and the red lines are the 35 to 64-year-olds in the country. And they're basically saying, yeah, our minds haven't changed in these last 4 years. But look at the young people in America. These are troubling data. In 2013, young people in America, almost 2/3 of them, over half of them, believed that a 4-year degree was worth the investment. And now it's down to 4 in 10. You know some of the things that have happened in America, not the least of which has been a presidential transition, and a whole different rhetoric about what the world is and how we should be investing in it and what we should be doing to prepare for it. But when I look back at these historical trends and all the things that needed to be done to change how the United States dealt with students in higher education, and then to see what can happen in 4 short years is very troubling. It's very unsettling. Now, 1954, do the math, I'm 64. I was born the same year a university was founded. 1954. Riverside is one of what the Times of London calls, Times Higher Education rather, calls a golden age university. There were a group of universities around the world that were founded in the decade or two after the Second World War, and we're one of them. We're ranked at number 4 in the United States in terms of quality of golden age universities, something like 16 around the globe, or number 16 or something like that. We were founded at a time when a lot of these things were going on in America, particularly the access questions in the United States were being addressed in a key way. And we did what we could to take advantage of them. So this is a demographic description of the United States. On the left-hand side are undergraduate students in the US today. And the huge yellow piece are white or Caucasian students. White students dominate the higher education system in the United States, and the whites still are the majority population in the United States, so not too surprising there. The light blue, gray wedge there in the bottom, the color is a little different, are African American students. The brighter turquoise is Hispanic students. Our Hispanic population in the United States is growing very fast, and that wedge continues to grow. The rest are indigenous peoples, American Indians, some international students, and we have in our census the ability to identify yourself as 2 or more races, unspecified, and that can be any number of different things, Asian and European and the rest, so a group of students of 2 or more backgrounds. So that's the United States. On the right-hand side is the University of California, Riverside, and you can see what has happened here. The Asian American piece is the black piece that has grown, and on the right, the Hispanic piece has grown, and the Caucasian piece is now a very small wedge in the middle. California has a very large Hispanic population, but it isn't. We have a lot of white students too, but of the University of California campuses, we've become the place where students of color believe that there's a great chance of success, and you heard some of the data earlier. So we've become a spot for students of all kinds of backgrounds to come. In addition, over half of our students are Pell students, students from the lower SES in America. So we have, for America, a relatively poor and very diverse student body. But like I said, that isn't just because we live in California, because we look like this, but most of the rest of the University of California campuses don't. The University of California, Irvine is 40 miles away, 30 miles away. It looks very different in terms of this demographic profile, and UCLA's 50 miles away. It looks very different from us. So this is something that happened deliberately, and it happened with purpose at the university. Again, I apologize for the small numbers at the bottom of this. 1993 on the left, and 2014 or 15, I think, on the right. This is the percentage of our undergraduate student body from what we call underrepresented minorities. In the United States, we think about African American students, Native American students, and Hispanic students as underrepresented in society, underrepresented in leadership positions, underrepresented in higher education. We don't include Asian American students because they are not underrepresented, they're well represented. So this is the percentage of those students from groups who traditionally in America have not been advantaged. And you can see the growth from 18% to 45%. That does not mimic the growth in those populations in the state of California. What that reflects is a deliberate and purposeful effort to seek out students, encourage their attendance, and support them at the university. And that's why our graph looks different from most of the rest of America, particularly those universities like ours that are high-profile research institutes. There are essentially none large research organizations that have this kind of profile. And it's because over a period of time, we, and before I was there, I'm not taking credit for this, but we as a university were very deliberate about reaching out to communities, individuals, families, churches, and encouraging and supporting students in this process. So what does that mean? These are the data you saw a moment ago for the nation. 49% graduation rates for Pell students and 40% for African American students. These are University of California Riverside data for the same groups. And the yellow bar is 2010 because it takes, remember these are 6-year graduation rates, it takes that long for them to get through the tube here. And for the University of California Riverside, the dark blue is 2010, the lighter blue is 11, to give you a little sense of the trend. We're very proud of the fact that those bars are essentially all the same size. The Asian Americans are starting to take off on us, and we're not trying to hold them back, don't get me wrong. But our other, particularly underrepresented groups, are doing much better than most anyone around the country. And importantly, as you heard earlier too, we haven't been satisfied with just being comparable. We're pushing hard to move these numbers. And moving graduation rates up even 1% in 1 year is huge. It takes a huge push to get that done. I stuck this slide in to make a fine point on this. And we talked a little bit about, even in some of the discussions yesterday, that we have competing interests and goals in a university. And it's, since I was a young professor, 1980, I'm feeling like old here today, my first day in the faculty is 1980. The tension between teaching and research, and you got to get your work done, and what's more important, what's the university reward, what does the university prioritize, and so forth. And we have come too often to think of these things as incompatible and competing. But they don't have to be. During the same period of time when we were making huge progress on graduation rates, we made huge progress in growing our research programs. This is a 50% increase in research funding at our university over that same period of time. So these aren't mutually exclusive. They're like so many things in life. If you're purposeful and well-intentioned and work hard, you can get things done, whether it's research growth or graduation rates, or in this case, both. So particularly from those of you from the Big Five, don't be dissuaded by the notion that this doesn't work for you. It works for us, and we've got data to prove it. Now, when I think about the United States and South Africa, so many parallels in our histories, so many things that we're proud of and so many things we wish weren't in our histories. But one of the places I think that you have an advantage over us, well, probably a couple places, but one is you're more dynamic right now than we are in higher education. We have over 3,000 universities and colleges, and too many of them think life is pretty good. You saw Harvard, 1636. It's evolved to what it is today, but Harvard's not very interested in changing much more, right? I mean, they think they're okay, like they are. And I could go down a longer list of most of the universities in the Ivy League. I would go ahead, even if my colleague chancellors were here, probably the University of California, Berkeley, and University of California, Los Angeles aren't that interested in evolving a lot because they think they're pretty good right now. South Africa, I feel much more energy about the future and a sense that where we are is great, but it's not nearly where we want to be. And the collective energy, I think, is something to really take advantage of. Excuse me. Now, that has bad parts. This is Wits, of course, in 1989. But in the lower right, that's Berkeley in the 60s. I mean, the things that vex us, again, different points in time, but students can help lead us to the notion that things have to change. So what have changed for us? This is a picture that I'm quite proud of. This is the leadership at the University of California, Riverside. And these are deans, vice chancellors, vice provost. Ken's in there. Where are you, Ken? Ken's over, yeah, Ken, raise your hand. Ken's in the middle row, far left. I'm the white guy in the middle. Most of America in higher education, if you look at the leadership cohort, it's a bunch of white men. increasingly some white women, but not much else. In the same way our university was deliberate about enrollment of undergraduates through the later part of the 20th century, we in the last few years have been very deliberate about who students see when they come to the campus. We have made a purposeful effort to change the face of the leadership. And again, this is a much more, we have an African-American woman as our Dean of Medicine. There are only 3 or 4 in the country probably. We have an African-American woman who's the director of our athletics programs. In Division I, the highest tier athletics in the country, there are 3 of them. So we've been pretty purposeful about changing the face of things. I can tell you we've struggled most in diversifying our faculty. In America, too many of the students who move to graduate work and move on to become faculty members in universities are white. And so the pool is much smaller than we wish it were, but we're working very hard to transform that component as well. And we've talked a lot about the University Innovation Alliance. The schools around the country that are, most of them, if I can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 7 of them are those that were founded as part of the Morrill Act of 1860. This is a group, again, purposeful on our part. There are 3,000 universities in the country. These are the 11 that stepped up and said, hey, we have a problem here, we want to address it. So purposeful at the leadership level, purposeful at the institutional level, purposeful at the undergraduate level, and purposeful at the national level. These are 4 clippings, headlines, of things that I've written in the last couple of years that try to make the points that we've made in this room for the nation. And you can see the upper right one is an opinion piece I put in Newsweek magazine, which gets a lot of readers. And it looks like I'm taking on the Ivy Leagues, Yale and Harvard and the rest. What I was actually doing was taking on the press. Too much of the conversation in America about higher education is about what's happening at Harvard. I'm on record as saying, nobody cares about Harvard. my American colleagues, I don't always get that applause. The reason I say nobody cares about Harvard is, number one, almost nobody goes. It's a very small school. There are just a few thousand students there, unbeknownst to most of us, particularly undergraduates. There are very few students, number one. Number two, it's the same students who were going in 1600. It's a few students from a few rich families who continue to go to Harvard. Now, everybody wants to go to Harvard in their mind, so that gets all kinds of attention. But to have articles written about higher education based on Harvard is irrelevant to 99.9% of America. It just doesn't matter. But that's and for those of us in the United States, if you read the national press, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, there's always the, quote, elite schools and what's going on there. And so, while this looks like I'm mad at Harvard, Harvard's fine, I'm fine. But we have to change the narrative, and that has to happen in the press. So that's one thing we didn't talk much about yesterday. As we think about our nation, finding ways to talk to the right people at the right publications about the things that really are important from your perspective. You're the ones that know higher education and know your students and know learning so much better than the politicians do. No offense to the minister, who is an outstanding woman, but in general, the people closest to this are going to know more about it. You got to get to the press and help them understand this as well. So this is a bit of hope for America. And the hope isn't so much in the numbers as in the perspective. We finally now have moved from a world of measuring success as access, with all those curves in enrollment, to one we're measuring success in terms of graduation rates. And now we're getting deeper down into what really happens to individual students in their lives. And these are data now that come from the CLIMB initiative. It's down there at the capital C, capital L, capital I, capital M, capital B, acronym for something. And these show the percent of students at a university who came to the university in the bottom quintile of family income in America. And I forget the numbers, it's like at age 35 or something, had moved into the top quintile. So a lot more sophisticated notion of impact on students. So run this again. These are students who came into the university poor, and X number of years after graduating had moved into the top 20% of income in the country. So the percentages are small because, you know, it's a percentage of a percentage. But take a look. The ones at the top, from the red line up, those are the top 10 or 15 in the country, and we're number 5, are all public universities. The ones below the red line are the privates, and you can look at the average across the country. Only 2% of the students in a university in America are poor students who eventually do well economically. We're proud of the fact that the University of California, 7% of our students are poor students who will do well economically. There's an awful lot of them start in that poor group and move into the second quintile or the third quintile, which is huge. But this is the most stringent test, from the very bottom to the very top. Okay? These are the kinds of numbers for us that are becoming much more important for us in higher education. I can tell you they're far from being most important to our press and to most of America, because this is a pretty nuanced and sophisticated kind of analysis to be tracking and monitoring and comparing universities. But I want to end where I began. It's great to be here. I've already only been here on the ground in South Africa 36 hours, I think. But I've learned a lot, made a lot of great friends, but it's not my first friend from South Africa. I had the great pleasure of meeting Archbishop Tutu a few years ago, and I can tell you all of his charms and all of his talents are reflected in all of you here today, so it's been a great delight, and thank you so much.